The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl pull a rusted case from a trench, and its contents should have stayed buried in war. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was late afternoon when Jake Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, found himself on a long, winding road outside a small, forgotten town. He had been riding all day, his Harley's engine humming steadily beneath him. As he cruised through the rain-soaked streets, he caught sight of something unusual. A small figure standing alone near the edge of an old trench, the ground littered with remnants of what seemed like a forgotten time. The figure was a little girl, no older than 8 or 9, her clothes dirty and her hair matted against her face by the rain. She was bent over, struggling to pull something heavy from the earth. Intrigued, Jake slowed his bike, the engine growling as he came to a stop. He watched her for a moment, his instincts telling him to keep his distance, but something about her caught his attention. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. In fact, she seemed determined, as though she knew exactly what she was looking for. The trench where she worked her small hands was deep, surrounded by remnants of war, rusted metal pieces, broken glass, and old, forgotten remnants. It was a place where history had been buried, and yet here she was, digging through it with the persistence only a child could possess. Jake's curiosity got the better of him, and before he knew it, he found himself stepping off his bike and walking towards her. "Hey there," Jake called out, his voice rough from years of smoking and shouting over engine noise. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. She instinctively pulled back, clutching the rusted object in her hands like it was the most precious thing in the world. For a moment, Jake stood still, studying her. She was so small, yet there was a resolve in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "What's that you're holding?" he asked, though he already had an idea. The girl hesitated, glancing down at the object, a rusted metal case, covered in dirt and grime. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I found it. It's mine now." Jake knelt down beside her, trying to soften his presence, despite his intimidating look, tattoos, leather jacket, and a face that could freeze the bravest man in his tracks. "You shouldn't be out here alone, kid. It's dangerous." She looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance, clearly not trusting him, but also unwilling to let go of the case. "I'm not alone," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'm looking for something." Jake watched her for a long moment, torn between caution and an inexplicable urge to help. It was then that he noticed the unease in the way she clutched the case, as if it held a secret, one that, for reasons he couldn't explain, needed to remain hidden. Without another word, Jake reached out, his calloused hands gently taking the case from her grasp. The girl didn't resist, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was scared, but also determined to protect whatever was inside. Jake ran his fingers over the case, feeling the weight of it, the history it seemed to carry. It was clear this wasn't just some relic of the past. It was important, and whatever it contained, it should have stayed buried. As he stood up, dusting his hands off, he realized something was very wrong. A chill ran down his spine, the kind of feeling he hadn't experienced in years, like the past was reaching out to him, trying to pull him into a story he had no business being a part of. He glanced at the little girl, now standing beside him, her eyes filled with a quiet fear he couldn't ignore. He had no idea what this case meant, or why it mattered to her, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. As Jake stood there, holding the rusted metal case in his hands, the weight of the moment settled in. The little girl, no more than 8 or 9, watched him closely, her small face etched with uncertainty. He could feel the tension in the air, thick, with something unspoken. Her fingers twitched, as though she wanted to take the case back, but Jake wasn't about to hand it over just yet. He wasn't even sure why he was so reluctant to let it go. There was something about the girl, the case, and the entire situation that felt far more dangerous than it seemed at first. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling crawling up his spine. "You didn't answer me before. What is this?" Jake asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The girl hesitated, then slowly, almost reluctantly, spoke. My dad said it was for when the war was over. He told me to keep it safe. She glanced nervously at the case in Jake's hands before quickly looking away. I don't really know what's inside, but it's important. He said I had to protect it. Jake studied her, his brow furrowing. There was something in her eyes, fear, but also something deeper, something that spoke of things no child should have to know. Where's your father now? He asked, his tone softer this time. The girl flinched, and Jake immediately regretted his question. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who had lost more than they could bear. He's gone, she said quietly, almost to herself. I'm the only one left. Jake's heart sank. He wasn't the type to feel sorry for people, but there was something about this little girl's situation that cut through the tough exterior he had spent years building. He crouched down to her level, trying to soften his presence as much as possible. I'm sorry, he said genuinely. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. She didn't reply, but the way she clutched the case to her chest spoke volumes. Jake sighed, running a hand through his graying beard, and glanced around. The rain had stopped, but the heavy clouds still loomed, casting a dark shadow over the trench where the girl had found the case. The wind rustled the trees in the distance, and the world felt eerily quiet. He needed to make a decision. He didn't trust the situation, but something in his gut told him he couldn't just walk away. Not with this girl, and certainly not with that case. Listen, kid, Jake said, standing up slowly. We're not staying out here. I'll take you. Somewhere safe, all right. She nodded silently, but her eyes never left the case. As Jake led her toward his bike, the gravity of what had just happened began to settle over him. He had no idea what was inside that case, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it had been buried for a reason, and now it was in his hands. They rode in silence, the girl clinging to his back, her small body pressed against his leather jacket. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the case. It wasn't just any relic from the past. There was something about it, something ancient and heavy with history, that made him uneasy. When they finally arrived at his garage, Jake helped the girl off the bike, his movements careful, almost protective. Stay here, he told her, his voice gruff as he stepped into the dimly lit building. He needed to check the case, figure out what they were dealing with. Inside the garage, the old tools and parts lay scattered around, the place smelling of motor oil and dust. Jake set the case down on the workbench and slowly began to examine it. The metal was weathered, but not beyond repair. It had been buried for a long time, that much was clear. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to the girl. What kind of life had she lived? What had she seen? And what kind of secrets did that case hold? Finally, the lid of the case creaked open, and Jake peered inside. His breath caught in his throat as he saw what was inside. It wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't money, or weapons, or anything tangible. Instead, there was a set of documents, old, faded, and covered in cryptic markings. As he flipped through them, something caught his eye. A name he recognized. It was the name of someone from his past, someone he thought he had left behind long ago. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a relic from the past. This was a key to something much bigger, something that had been buried for a reason. As Jake stared at the documents, his mind raced. He had just stumbled into something much larger than he had ever imagined. And there was no turning back now. Jake sat at the workbench, the faded documents spread out before him. His mind raced as he carefully examined each page. They were old, the edges curled and torn, as if they had been hidden away for decades. The symbols and markings on the pages were unfamiliar, but there was one name that stood out. It was the name of a man he had hoped never to hear again, Colonel Richard Mason. Jake's heart skipped a beat as memories of the past flooded back. Colonel Mason was the leader of a secretive military operation that Jake had been a part of during his time in the service. It was a mission that had gone wrong, a mission that had left him scarred both physically and emotionally. And now, somehow, this case had brought that name back into his life. The girl was standing in the doorway, watching him with those wide, uncertain eyes. Jake looked up at her, his face hardening. You know who this man is? He asked, his voice cold. The girl hesitated before nodding. He's the one who told my dad to keep it safe, she said softly. He said that if anyone ever came looking for it, we had to protect it. Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This was no ordinary case. This was a part of something much bigger, something that had been buried for years. He had never imagined that his past would come back to haunt him in this way. Your dad was involved with Mason? Jake asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. He wasn't just any soldier, the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He was part of the team that worked for Mason. My dad told me stories, but he never talked about the details. He said it was dangerous, and that I should never ask too many questions. Jake's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still so much he didn't understand. He knew that Colonel Mason's operation had been shady, to say the least. There had been rumors of illegal weapons deals, covert missions, and cover-ups. Jake had tried to forget all of it, but now the past was coming back with a vengeance. We need to find out what's in this, Jake muttered, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the pages of the documents. The girl stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the case. Please don't open it, she said, her voice trembling. I know it's important, but I'm scared. What if it's too dangerous? Jake paused, looking at her. He could see the fear in her eyes, and for a moment, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting her, too. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Jake said, his voice firm. He stood up and walked to the door of the garage, glancing outside. The night had fallen, and the air was thick with tension. He could feel it, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The case, the documents, the name, everything was leading him down a path he couldn't turn away from. We're not safe here, Jake said, his voice low. We need to move. The girl looked up at him, her face pale. Where are we going? She asked. I don't know yet, Jake replied. But we need to figure this out. Whatever's in that case, whoever's after it, they won't stop until they get it. The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Jake grabbed the case and the documents, tucking them into his leather jacket. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for sure. His past had just caught up with him. As he walked to the back of the garage, he could hear the sound of a car approaching. It was faint, but it was there, and it was getting closer. Jake's instincts kicked in. Stay behind me, he ordered, his voice sharp. The girl did as she was told, taking a step back. Jake's hand went to the handle of his motorcycle, his fingers wrapping around the cool metal. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever was coming, but he wasn't about to back down. The car pulled into the driveway, its headlights blinding for a moment. Jake could see the silhouette of a man stepping out of the vehicle. He didn't recognize him, but the man was tall, built like a brick wall, and his movements were calculated. He was someone dangerous. You got the case? The man called out, his voice gravelly. Jake's heart raced. He didn't answer immediately, but his mind was already racing with possibilities. He couldn't let this man take the case, not when he was so close to finding out what it all meant. Who are you? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. The man took a step forward, his eyes cold and calculating. Doesn't matter who I am, he said. What matters is what's in that case. Hand it over. Jake's grip tightened on the motorcycle handle, his knuckles turning white. This was it. The moment he had been trying to avoid. The past was here, and it was demanding answers. He couldn't run anymore. The man's eyes flickered to the girl standing behind Jake, and for the first time, a flicker of hesitation passed across his face. Jake noticed it immediately, his instincts telling him to use it to his advantage. You're not taking it, Jake said firmly, stepping in front of the girl. Not without a fight. The man's face hardened. You don't know who you're messing with. Jake stood tall, his heart pounding. He had no idea who this guy was, but he was done running. Whatever was in that case was about to change everything. The man took another step forward, his expression hardening as he sized up Jake. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension, as if both men could feel the inevitable clash coming. Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let this man take the case, no matter what. His hand rested on the handle of his motorcycle, but he knew he was more than ready for a fight if it came to that. The man's eyes flickered over to the girl, standing behind Jake, her small frame a stark contrast to the tension in the air. She hadn't moved an inch, her eyes wide with fear, but also a strange calmness. It was as if she had seen danger before and knew how to handle it. The man noticed the girl's stillness, and his gaze softened for just a moment. Jake saw it, the hesitation, but he didn't trust it. He couldn't. Not now. You're making a big mistake, the man said, his voice colder than before. You really want to do this? Jake's voice was steady, unshaken. I don't know who you are, but I know you're not getting that case. The man stepped closer, the sound of his boots crunching the gravel underfoot as he moved with purpose. That's not your decision to make, he said, his tone low and dangerous. The air seemed to thicken, and for a brief moment, Jake considered his options. He was alone with this man, the girl behind him, the case between them, and the looming threat of whatever this stranger wanted. But Jake had dealt with worse. Much worse. He had been in situations where the stakes were higher, where he had fought for his life and lost more than he could ever count. But this time, something felt different. This wasn't just about the case. It wasn't just about the past. This time, it was about protecting someone who had no one left to protect her. The man took another step closer, his presence intimidating, but Jake didn't back down. Instead, he squared his shoulders and made himself a wall between the man and the girl. I'm not afraid of you, Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The man's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. He took another step forward, but just as he did, a noise echoed from the distance. It was the sound of a car approaching, its engine growling as it rumbled down the dirt road. The man paused, his attention shifting to the car, but Jake didn't give him the chance to react. He moved quickly, shoving the man backward just as the car came into view. The headlights cut through the darkness like a blade, and the car came to a screeching halt. From inside the vehicle, a tall figure stepped out. It was another man, this one dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. Jake's heart sank as he recognized the silhouette. He didn't need to see the man's face to know who he was. It was a face he had seen before, a face that had haunted him for years. The man was part of the operation, the same operation that had left Jake broken and scarred. He had been part of the group that had betrayed him, the group that had pushed him to the edge and left him for dead. Jake's grip tightened on the case in his hands, his pulse quickening as memories of the past came flooding back. The betrayal, the lies, the pain. And now, this man was here. The man who had been part of the reason Jake had walked away from it all. The man who had helped bury the truth. The figure in the hooded jacket stepped forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Jake Morrison, he said, his voice calm, almost mocking. I see you're still playing the hero. Jake's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. This isn't about me, Jake said, his voice low but filled with authority. It's about her. He nodded toward the girl, who was still standing behind him, watching the scene unfold. The man in the hooded jacket glanced at her, his expression unreadable. She doesn't know what she's holding, he said. And neither do you. Jake's eyes narrowed. You're wrong, he said. I know exactly what this is. And I'm not letting you take it. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You think you have a choice in this? He asked. This case belongs to us. And you're standing in the way of something much bigger than you can imagine. Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't about to let this man intimidate him. Not again. He had been a pawn in this game once before, and he wasn't about to let anyone use him again. Not now. Not ever. I don't care what's in that case, Jake said, his voice hardening. What I care about is keeping her safe. And if that means standing in your way, then that's exactly what I'll do. The man's smile faded, his eyes flashing with anger. He took a step forward, but Jake was ready. Without warning, Jake grabbed the handle of his motorcycle and swung it toward the man. The two collided with a loud crash, the sound of fists hitting flesh and the metal of the bike scraping against the ground. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. The girl watched in silence, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a strange sense of resolve. This wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was the life she had found herself in. And she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. Jake and the man in the hooded jacket lay in a tangled heap on the ground, the sound of grunts and the clashing of bodies filling the air. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles straining as he shoved the man off of him. The fight had escalated quickly, and now both of them were on the ground, wrestling for control of the situation. The man's hands were strong, but Jake's determination was stronger. He wasn't going to let this guy take the case, not after everything that had happened. With a swift move, Jake knocked the man's hands away, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him back. The man scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip, his eyes flashing with fury. You're making a mistake, the man snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Jake stood tall, his breathing heavy, but his resolve unshaken. "I'm not making any mistake," he said, his voice steady. "You're not taking this case. Not now, not ever." The man glared at him, clearly weighing his options. He wasn't going to back down without a fight, but something about Jake's unwavering stance seemed to give him pause. "This isn't just about you, Jake," the man said, his voice softer now, though still menacing. "It's bigger than you think." Jake narrowed his eyes. "I don't care about your bigger picture," he said, his voice cold. "What I care about is keeping her safe." He glanced at the girl behind him, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She wasn't just a bystander in this. She was the reason Jake was fighting. The man in the hooded jacket looked over his shoulder at the girl, then back at Jake. "You really think this will end well for her?" he asked, his tone mocking. "She has no idea what she's holding. No idea who's looking for it." Jake's grip on the case tightened. "She doesn't need to know. All she needs to know is that I'm going to protect her. And you're not going to stop me." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty for a brief moment. But then he straightened, his jaw clenched. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Morrison," he said. "This isn't just a simple case. There are people who will stop at nothing to get what's in that case. And you're going to get caught in the crossfire." Jake didn't flinch. He had been through worse than this. He had seen what people were capable of when they wanted something badly enough. He wasn't about to let anyone get to the girl, no matter who they were. "I've been in worse situations than this," Jake said, his voice low. "I can handle it." The man stepped back, his gaze lingering on the girl for a moment longer before he turned to leave. "You've made your choice, Morrison," he said, his voice cold. "But don't think this is over. You're in this now, and you won't get out without blood on your hands." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped off into the night. Jake watched him go, his heart still racing. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. For now. He turned to the girl, who was still standing behind him, her small face pale with fear. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her eyes still held that haunted look. She had been through so much already, and now, with the case in their hands, it was only going to get worse. "I didn't know what I was getting into," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to know everything right now," he said. "But I'm going to make sure you're safe. I promise." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and a touch of hope. Jake didn't know how he was going to protect her from whatever was coming, but he would figure it out. He had to. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm. "Get in the car." The girl hesitated, but then nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. Jake started the engine, the sound of the bike roaring to life as they pulled out of the garage and onto the darkened road. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here. Not with the case in their possession. Not with the past catching up to them. As they drove through the night, Jake's mind raced. He had no idea who was after the case, or what kind of people they were, but he was certain of one thing. They were coming. And he wasn't going to let them get the girl. Not without a fight. Jake's motorcycle roared down the highway, the dim light from the street lamps flashing past as they sped toward the unknown. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being followed. The roads were empty, but every instinct in him told him that someone was out there, watching them. The girl sat quietly beside him, her small hands gripping the sides of her seat as they sped through the night. He glanced at her, wondering what she was thinking. She had been through so much already, and now, with everything that was happening, Jake couldn't help but feel responsible for her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had only planned to pass through this town, to stay under the radar, but now he was tangled in something much bigger. The case, the documents, Mason, it was all too much, too quickly. The girl caught his eye and gave him a small, tentative smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. Jake didn't have a clear answer. He had no plan, no destination in mind. All he knew was that they couldn't stay where they were, and the people after the case wouldn't stop until they had it. "I don't know yet," Jake said, keeping his eyes on the road. "But we'll figure it out. We just need to keep moving." The girl nodded, though her gaze remained distant, as if lost in her own thoughts. Jake didn't blame her. He could only imagine what was going through her head. The past few hours had been nothing short of a whirlwind. It wasn't just the case anymore. It was the danger, the people chasing them, and the twisted path that had somehow led them to this moment. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the road behind them. Nothing. Yet, the feeling in his gut told him they weren't alone. They couldn't be. There was no way Mason's men would just let them go. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of their next move. He needed a safe place, somewhere to lay low, somewhere to figure out what was really going on. But time was running out. He didn't know how long they had before someone showed up, but he could feel the clock ticking. As they neared a fork in the road, Jake took the left turn, heading toward an old gas station on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place no one would think to look for them. The parking lot was empty, and the neon sign flickered weakly in the night. He pulled the motorcycle into the lot and parked near the old gas pumps. The girl climbed off the bike, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "Is this safe?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. Jake didn't answer right away. He was still trying to decide if it was safe, if they could trust this place. He looked around, his hand instinctively going to the case hidden under his jacket. The night felt oppressive, like something was about to happen. "We'll be okay for now," Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure of that. They had to be quick. The fewer people who saw them, the better. "Stay close," he added, glancing at the girl. "And don't leave my side." She nodded, though her eyes were still full of uncertainty. Jake led the way into the small convenience store attached to the gas station. The door creaked as they entered, and the smell of stale coffee and dust hit him immediately. It was a quiet, run-down place, but that was exactly what they needed right now, low profile, out of sight. Jake approached the counter where an older man stood behind the register. The man looked up as they entered, his eyes briefly lingering on the girl before returning to Jake. He didn't seem surprised to see them, which made Jake uneasy. "You need anything?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. "Just some water," Jake replied, his tone guarded. The man nodded and grabbed a bottle from the shelf, setting it down on the counter. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out cash, paying for the water without another word. As the man handed him the change, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been in enough tight spots to know when someone was watching him, when something wasn't right. He turned to leave, the girl following him closely behind. Just as he stepped outside, he heard a faint noise, a car engine idling in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a passing car. This was different. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated. Jake's hand went to his jacket, his fingers brushing against the case. The girl stopped beside him, her eyes wide. "What's happening?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Stay here," Jake said, his voice low and firm. He didn't want to drag her into this, but he had no choice. He had to figure out who was following them. He quickly moved to the side of the building, his steps light as he tried to make out the shape of the car. He peeked around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. There, just a few yards away, a black SUV sat idling, its headlights off, engine purring softly. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a coincidence. Mason's men were here. They had found them. They were too close now, and Jake knew they had no time to waste. He couldn't afford to let this drag on. He had to act fast. He returned to the girl, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "We're leaving," he said, grabbing her hand. "Now." They ran back to the motorcycle, and without wasting any more time, Jake kicked the engine into gear. The tires screeched as they sped off into the night, the sound of the engine cutting through the silence. Jake knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was about to begin. Jake's heart pounded as the black SUV tailed them, its headlights glaring through the rearview mirror. He could hear the hum of the engine behind him, growing louder with every mile. The air was thick with tension, the night cloaked in shadows as they raced through the winding roads. His grip tightened on the handlebars, every instinct screaming at him to go faster, to lose them. But he knew better than to outrun a problem like this. The girl sat behind him, her small hands gripping him tightly as the wind whipped through her hair. He could feel her fear, the same fear he was trying to suppress in his own chest. "Hold on tight," Jake said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. He needed a plan, and fast. The girl didn't say anything, but he could feel her pressing closer to him, her body tense against his back. They had no time to waste. The SUV wasn't just following them, it was hunting them. Jake had no doubt that Mason's men were behind the wheel. He didn't know who they were, but he could sense the danger in the air, thick and suffocating. They weren't going to stop until they had the case, and they weren't afraid to do whatever it took to get it. Jake turned the corner sharply, the tires screeching as he took the turn too fast. The motorcycle's engine roared, the speedometer creeping up as he pushed it to its limits. He needed to shake them off, but he couldn't risk losing control. Not with the girl on the back. The SUV followed closely, its headlights burning brighter as it stayed right on their tail. Jake glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, and saw the silhouette of the vehicle looming in the distance. The man in the SUV wasn't giving up. Jake's mind raced as he scanned the road ahead. There was an old bridge coming up, one that led into a more remote area. It wasn't the safest route, but it might be their best chance. Without thinking twice, Jake turned onto the narrow bridge, hoping the SUV would hesitate. The planks creaked under the weight of the motorcycle as they sped across, the sound echoing in the night. But the SUV didn't hesitate. It followed, its tires skimming the edge of the wooden planks, barely staying on the road. Jake's eyes narrowed. He needed to create some distance. He twisted the throttle harder, urging the motorcycle forward. The wind howled in his ears, the engine's roar drowning out everything else. As they neared the end of the bridge, Jake spotted a sharp turn up ahead. It was risky, but it was their only shot. "Hold on," he warned the girl. She squeezed her arms around him tighter, her face pressed into his back. Without a second thought, Jake leaned into the turn, the motorcycle leaning dangerously close to the edge. The wheels squealed as they barely made it around, the back tire sliding slightly before finding grip again. He didn't dare look back this time. The road ahead was their only focus. The SUV was still there, but it was slower now, falling behind. Jake's heart raced as the adrenaline flooded his system. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. He had to keep moving, keep running. The girl's grip on him tightened, and Jake could feel her trembling. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, that they were going to be fine, but he didn't know that for sure. The danger was real, and it was closing in on them. The road ahead was winding and treacherous, and Jake pushed the motorcycle harder, weaving through the curves. He could hear the SUV behind them, the engine growling like a predator on the hunt. The sound made his stomach churn. They couldn't outrun them forever. Jake's eyes scanned the road, his mind searching for a way out. That's when he saw it. A dirt road leading off to the left. It was barely visible, hidden by overgrown trees and shadows. Without hesitation, Jake veered off the main road, the bike bouncing over the uneven terrain. The SUV didn't follow. At least not immediately. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady the bike. The path was narrow, overgrown, and the headlights of the SUV were nowhere to be seen. They had lost them. For now, Jake slowed the bike, looking around. The area was secluded, the trees thick and the silence almost deafening. They had bought themselves some time, but it wouldn't last. He turned the bike around and parked it off the side of the path, out of sight from the road. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Jake said, looking at the girl. She had been silent for a while, her face pale and eyes wide. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. Jake didn't have a clear answer. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay here for long. "We're going to keep moving," Jake said, his voice firm. "Stay close. We'll find somewhere safe." The girl nodded, though her expression was full of uncertainty. She didn't understand everything, but she knew enough to see the danger they were in. As they walked into the dense woods, Jake felt a strange sense of urgency. The case in his jacket was a ticking time bomb, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could stay ahead of the people chasing them. But one thing was certain. He was going to protect her, no matter the cost. Jake moved through the thick woods, the underbrush cracking beneath his boots as he glanced back every few seconds, still sensing the threat lingering behind them. The girl was a few steps behind him, her face pale, eyes darting around nervously as they trekked deeper into the trees. He could feel her anxiety, but he had no time to console her. The threat wasn't just physical. It was the kind of danger that followed you like a shadow, closing in when you least expected it. The road they had taken earlier was long behind them, and now they were on foot. The bike was hidden further up the path, out of sight. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Jake had to find shelter for them, a place where they could catch their breath, figure out what came next. But there was no plan. Not really. All he had was the girl, the case, and the looming sense of a storm gathering on the horizon. As they walked, the air grew colder, the dense trees blocking most of the light. The silence felt unnatural, the kind of quiet that only came when something was about to break it. Every now and then, Jake would hear the faintest sound, the crunch of a twig or the rustle of leaves. But whenever he turned, there was nothing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He was being watched. "Where are we going?" the girl asked again, her voice barely a whisper. Jake's eyes flickered to her, and for the first time in a long while, he realized how much he hated the position they were in. He hated the uncertainty. "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "But we can't stay out here for long." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with truth. They needed to keep moving, but Jake didn't know where to go. He didn't know what they were running from anymore. Mason's men? Sure. But what about the bigger picture? What about the documents? Jake's mind raced as the path ahead grew darker. His past, his mistakes, they were all coming home to roost. And he had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Then, he saw it. Up ahead, a faint light through the trees. He motioned for the girl to stay behind him as he moved closer, careful not to make a sound. The light grew brighter, and soon Jake found himself standing at the edge of a clearing. In the center was an old cabin, its wooden walls worn by time but sturdy, the light from inside casting a soft glow against the dark. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Jake approached cautiously, his instincts telling him to be on alert. He was no stranger to places like this, the kind of rundown shacks that were hidden away from prying eyes. But this one felt different, like someone might be waiting inside. The girl, still behind him, didn't speak, but Jake could tell she was hesitant. He didn't blame her. The world they had stepped into was no longer one she could understand. He knocked on the door, not too hard, but loud enough to be heard. There was a long pause before he heard footsteps inside. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a tall man with a graying beard and a weathered face. He wore a plaid shirt and jeans, his expression unreadable as his eyes scanned Jake, then the girl. "What do you want?" the man asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. Jake stood his ground, not showing any signs of weakness. "We need a place to rest. Just for a while," Jake said, his voice firm but respectful. The man studied him for a moment longer before stepping aside. "Don't make any trouble," the man grumbled as Jake stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of wood smoke and dust. It was sparsely furnished, a couple of chairs, a table, and a small fireplace at the far end of the room. There was a single window with a curtain drawn over it, keeping out the chill of the night. Jake could feel the tension ease just slightly as they entered. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over their heads. The man closed the door behind them and turned to the girl. "You," he said, his eyes narrowing, "you don't belong out here." The girl didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the floor. Jake stepped in front of her. "She's with me," he said, his voice cold, making it clear that there was no room for argument. The man didn't seem pleased, but he didn't press the issue. "Sit down," he said instead, gesturing to the chairs. Jake and the girl took a seat, the silence hanging between them. The man went to the small kitchen and began rummaging through the cabinets. "You've got trouble following you, I can tell," the man muttered as he poured 2 cups of coffee. "I've seen it before. People like you always running, always hiding from something." Jake didn't respond right away, his thoughts elsewhere. The girl, who had been silent for so long, finally spoke up. "What's in the case?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Jake turned to her, the weight of her question sinking in. He hadn't told her everything, hadn't explained why they were running, why they were being hunted. But now, with the cabins quiet and the safety of being off the road, the truth seemed to hang in the air. He didn't want to lie to her. "I don't know exactly," Jake said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of frustration. "But it's something dangerous, something people are willing to kill for." The girl nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything more, but the look in her eyes told Jake that she understood more than he realized. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing again. The case, the documents, it wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something bigger at play. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become. The storm was coming, and no one could hide from it forever. Jake sat in the dimly lit cabin, his thoughts swirling as the weight of the case pressed down on him. The fire crackled quietly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The girl sat silently across from him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but Jake could feel the tension building between them. She was just a kid, caught up in something far bigger than she could understand. He couldn't help but wonder how she felt, what was going through her mind. "You want to talk about it?" Jake asked, his voice soft but insistent. The girl didn't respond right away. She was still looking down at her hands, her fingers nervously twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. It was clear she wasn't ready to speak, so Jake didn't push her. He had his own demons to deal with, his own questions that needed answers. The man who had let them in was still in the other room, mumbling to himself as he worked on something. Jake didn't trust him, but for now, they had no choice but to stay. The night was quiet, far too quiet for Jake's liking. He glanced over at the door, feeling the familiar tension that always came when he was hiding from the world. He knew someone was out there. Mason's men, the ones who had been chasing them. They weren't just going to let the case slip through their fingers. The documents inside that case had information that people would kill for. Jake's mind kept going back to that name, Colonel Richard Mason. The man had been a ghost, a figure from his past he never wanted to confront again. And now, somehow, the past had found its way back into his life. Jake was tired of running. He was tired of looking over his shoulder every minute, afraid that someone was going to find him. But now, with the girl in his care, everything was different. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He had to protect her, too. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. The girl's head snapped up, and for the first time since they arrived, she met his eyes. There was a look of uncertainty in her expression, a flicker of something. Fear, hope, maybe both. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What's going to happen to us?" Jake's heart sank. He wished he had the answers for her. He wished he could tell her everything would be okay, that they were going to get through this. But the truth was, he didn't know. All he could offer was his promise to keep her safe, even though he wasn't sure how long he could do that. "I don't know either," Jake admitted, his voice steady. "But I'll make sure no one hurts you. That's a promise." The girl seemed to consider his words for a moment, her eyes studying him carefully. "Why are they after us?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Jake exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the case hidden under his jacket. He didn't want to tell her everything, not yet. She was too young to understand the full scope of the danger they were in. But he couldn't keep lying to her either. "The case," he began, his voice low. "It has information in it that people want. Dangerous people. They'll stop at nothing to get it." The girl frowned, clearly confused. "But why me? Why do they want me?" Jake's stomach tightened. She didn't deserve to be in this mess. "No. One did. They're not after you specifically," Jake said, trying to reassure her. "It's the case. They think you know something about it." She was quiet for a moment, and Jake could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. "I don't know anything about it," she said, her voice small. Jake nodded, his expression hardening. He believed her. She had no idea what she was holding, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Mason's men thought she did, and they wouldn't stop until they had her, or worse, until they had what was in the case. "We're going to keep moving," Jake said, standing up and reaching for the case. The girl looked up at him, her face full of uncertainty. "Where are we going?" she asked again. Jake hesitated, his hand resting on the handle of the case. "We can't stay here," he said. "We need to get somewhere safer." The door creaked open, and the man from earlier stepped inside, a wary look in his eyes. He had been watching them from the other room. "You two are making a lot of noise," he said, his voice gruff. "What's going on?" Jake looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "We need to leave," Jake said. "This place isn't safe anymore." The man didn't argue, but his eyes flicked toward the girl, then back at Jake. "You got a plan?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Jake shook his head. "Not really," he admitted. "But we can't stay here. We'll figure it out as we go." The man grunted, clearly unimpressed. "Well, if you're leaving, you better do it fast," he said, his tone warning. "There's a truck pulling up outside. Looks like your friends are catching up to you." Jake's heart sank. He turned to the girl, his mind racing. They didn't have much time. He grabbed her hand and led her out the back door, his mind already calculating their next move. They had to go, and they had to go now. The night was closing in on them, and the storm was coming. There was no turning back. Jake could feel the tension building in his chest as they moved through the woods, the shadows of the trees stretching long in the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft, damp ground. Beneath them, the girl stayed close behind him, her eyes darting nervously to the left and right, as if expecting someone to leap from the shadows at any moment. They had barely made it out of the cabin before they heard the truck pull up, the tires crunching over gravel as it came to a screeching halt outside. Jake had been right to trust his instincts. Mason's men were already on their tail. He had to get them to safety, but where? The night was closing in around them, the dense woods offering little in the way of shelter, and the girl's fear was beginning to feel like a weight pressing down on him. He couldn't fail her. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. He turned to her as they moved, his voice low but steady. "Stay close. Don't say anything unless I tell you to. We can't risk being heard." She nodded, her face pale but determined. She understood the stakes now, even if she didn't fully grasp the danger they were in. Every step they took seemed to echo louder in the stillness of the night, but Jake's focus was sharp. His mind raced, calculating their next move. He had no plan, no place to go, just a gut feeling that they had to keep moving. As they approached a clearing in the woods, Jake slowed his pace, his hand instinctively going to the case hidden under his jacket. He couldn't afford to let anyone get their hands on it, not after everything that had happened. The sound of the truck had faded for the moment, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before the search party found them. He had to get them out of here. The clearing was small but offered a brief respite from the trees. There was a dilapidated shack in the center, barely visible through the thick brush. It looked abandoned, but it was the only place nearby that might offer them some cover. Jake led the way, his hand still gripping the case. The girl followed, keeping close, but Jake could feel the tension in her body. "What if they find us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't look back. "They will, but not yet. We have to stay ahead of them." He reached the shack first, cautiously peering inside through the cracked door. The place was dusty, the wooden floorboards creaking under his weight. There was a small table in the center, a single chair, and a few shelves lined with empty cans and boxes. It was as abandoned as it looked. Jake pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, motioning for the girl to follow. She hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in their temporary refuge. "This is where we'll stay for now," Jake said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We don't have much time. We need to keep quiet and stay out of sight." The girl nodded, her gaze flickering to the door. "What happens if they come here?" Jake's jaw tightened. "We'll deal with it when it happens." The girl looked down at her hands, her fingers twisted together nervously. Jake hated seeing her like this, vulnerable and afraid. She deserved so much more than this. "I'm scared," she said softly. "I know," Jake replied, his voice low. "But you're not alone. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." He turned to look at the door again, his mind constantly racing. He couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face whatever was coming. The case, the documents, everything that had been buried was now rising to the surface. Mason's men were just the beginning. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the case again, and for a brief moment, he let himself think about what might happen if they couldn't keep it safe. The thought made his stomach twist. The girl shifted beside him, and Jake glanced over at her. She was staring at him now, her expression solemn. "Why are they after us, Jake?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What's in that case?" Jake hesitated. He had never wanted to tell her the truth, but she deserved to know. She was already in this mess, and keeping secrets wasn't going to protect her. "The case contains information about something that was supposed to stay buried," Jake began slowly. "Something dangerous. And there are people who will do anything to get it. People who would hurt others to protect what's inside." The girl swallowed hard, her eyes wide. "But what if they find us? What if they take it?" Jake let out a long breath. "We're going to keep moving. I'll protect you, but we have to stay ahead of them. If they get that case, it's over." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. He knew he couldn't run forever, but for now, it was the only option. The night stretched on, the sound of the truck still faintly echoing in the distance. The minutes felt like hours, and every second that passed felt like it might be their last. Jake clenched his fists, the case still heavy against his side. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. No one was getting their hands on that case, not while he was breathing. They would have to go through him first. Jake stayed alert, his senses on edge as the hours passed in the small, musty shack. The girl was sitting quietly on the floor, her eyes occasionally drifting to the door, a look of unease never leaving her face. Jake's mind was spinning, trying to come up with a plan, but there were too many variables and too little time. The case. He kept thinking about the case. He had no idea what was really inside it, but whatever it was, it had set everything in motion. Mason's men were closing in, and there was no place safe anymore. The road ahead was getting darker, and Jake felt the weight of his past crashing back into the present. He wasn't sure how long they could keep running, or how much longer he could protect the girl. He glanced over at her again. She looked so small, so out of place in this dangerous world that had become their reality. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, the only sound breaking the silence. Jake was about to speak when he heard something, a sound coming from outside. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. Tires crunching on gravel. They were close. The truck was back. Jake's hand instinctively went to the case hidden beneath his jacket. His pulse quickened, but he didn't let the panic show. He had to stay calm. He motioned for the girl to stay still and quietly moved to the small window, peering out through the gaps in the boards. The glow of headlights filtered through the trees, and Jake saw the truck slow as it neared the clearing. His heart raced as he watched the men climb out. There were 3 of them, all wearing the same black tactical gear. They were serious, methodical, and they knew what they were doing. They were here for the case, the girl, and Jake. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here. The shack was too exposed, too vulnerable. If they didn't move, they were dead. Without making a sound, Jake grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her toward the back door. "We're leaving. Now," he whispered, his voice sharp. She didn't ask any questions, just followed him through the dark, her small body trembling with fear. Jake kept his pace steady, his mind calculating every step. They had to be quiet, they had to move fast. He could hear the men's voices now, distant but growing louder. They were spreading out, searching. Jake's mind raced as they made their way into the woods again. The trees were thick, but they offered some cover. He glanced over at the girl. "Keep up. Don't make a sound," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They were running out of time. Jake pushed forward, his eyes scanning the forest ahead. He could hear the men now, their voices too close for comfort. He pushed through the trees, leading the girl toward a small creek he remembered from years ago. It was a dead end, but it had one thing going for it: seclusion. There was a cave further up the stream that he had used before, long ago, when he needed to disappear. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide, a place where they could catch their breath. They reached the creek, the sound of rushing water filling the air as they crouched behind a large boulder. Jake held his breath, listening intently. The men were getting closer, but they hadn't spotted them yet. Jake's pulse thudded in his ears as he crouched lower, his body tense and ready to move at a moment's notice. He could feel the girl beside him, her small frame trembling in the cold night air. "We'll wait here for a few minutes," Jake whispered. "Then we'll move. Quiet and fast." He hoped he was right. They couldn't afford to get caught now. The men were still out there, moving closer. Jake had no idea how long they could stay hidden. His mind raced, thinking of their options, trying to come up with a way out of this nightmare. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the distance. Jake's head whipped around, his eyes searching the darkness. His grip on the girl tightened, pulling her closer to him. The men were almost here. They had to move. He didn't wait for another sound. Without a word, he grabbed the girl's hand and started running, keeping low to the ground. They darted through the trees, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the dense underbrush. The cold night air burned in his lungs as he ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, didn't stop to see if they were being followed. He couldn't afford to. The creek was just ahead. Jake pushed harder, his legs burning with the effort. The girl was struggling to keep up, but she didn't say a word. She was determined, and that made all the difference. They reached the creek, and Jake pulled her to the side, motioning for her to stay low. They crouched behind the rocks, the water rushing by just feet away. For a moment, they were hidden, safe in the shadows of the forest. Jake listened, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he waited. The men were close. Too close. He had to make a choice. There was no more running. No more hiding. The fight was coming. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. Jake crouched behind the rocks, his breath shallow and controlled, the cold water rushing past them in a constant stream. The girl was beside him, her small body trembling but still, like she understood the gravity of the moment. They had been running for what felt like hours, but now, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, they had a brief moment of safety. The sound of the men searching for them had faded, but Jake knew they weren't far. They were still out there, still hunting, still closing in. He glanced over at the girl, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. She looked so young, so innocent in all of this chaos, but Jake knew that she was tougher than she looked. She had been through more than any child should, and now, she was caught up in something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. "We need to move soon," Jake whispered, keeping his voice low so the men couldn't hear. He could hear their voices in the distance, but they weren't close enough yet. Still, it was only a matter of time. The girl nodded silently, her gaze shifting nervously to the dark trees around them. Jake knew she didn't have the full picture, didn't understand just how dangerous this had become, but he couldn't tell her everything. Some things were too heavy for someone her age to carry. Still, he couldn't deny that the burden weighed heavily on him. He had promised her he would protect her, but with every passing moment, the odds stacked higher against them. They weren't just running from Mason's men anymore. They were running from something much larger, something that would stop at nothing to get what was inside the case. Jake's grip tightened on the case as he thought about its contents, the secrets it held. Those secrets had already cost too many lives, and he couldn't afford for it to cost more. He had to get them out. They couldn't stay here. He pulled the girl to her feet, his eyes scanning the woods one more time before he began to move. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. They moved quickly, carefully, staying low to the ground. The shadows of the trees stretched long across their path, the silence almost suffocating. Every rustle, every crack of a branch underfoot, made Jake flinch, his senses on high alert. They made their way through the woods, the distant sound of the men still lingering in the background. Jake knew he couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face the consequences of what they were carrying. And the question gnawed at him, was it worth it? Was keeping the case safe really worth everything that was happening? He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the present. Right now, they just had to survive. And that meant getting out of this forest alive. They had to reach the next town, find some way to lay low, to disappear. They could disappear, right? He couldn't help but doubt himself, but there was no time for doubt. They kept moving, following the creek upstream, away from the clearing and the men who were surely still searching. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the trees thick and unwelcoming. But it felt safer here. For now, the girl was quiet, but Jake could feel the weight of her thoughts, could sense the fear she was trying to keep at bay. He couldn't blame her. He was afraid, too. They moved for what felt like hours, the world around them dark and oppressive. Every once in a while, Jake would glance back at the girl, making sure she was still there, still following. She never said anything, but Jake knew she was there, silent, but strong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, abandoned cabin nestled against a ridge, hidden in the woods. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place to regroup. Jake stopped in front of the door, his hand resting on the handle. He turned to the girl, his voice low. "We'll stay here for the night," he said. "We can't keep running, but we need to rest. Just for a bit." The girl didn't respond, but her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and relief. She was exhausted, too, but she was stronger than she let on. Jake could see that now. He opened the door slowly, his eyes scanning the room before stepping inside. The cabin was small and run down, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. They had to stay hidden. He led the girl inside and shut the door quietly behind them. The silence in the cabin was almost deafening. The only sound was the wind howling outside, the occasional creak of the wood settling. Jake checked the windows, making sure they were secure. He needed to be sure they weren't followed. "We're safe here," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Just for tonight." The girl didn't say anything, but she nodded, sitting down on the small couch near the window. She was still watching him, her eyes filled with questions he couldn't answer. Jake sank down beside her, his mind racing. They had a brief moment of peace, but it wasn't going to last. He could feel it. They needed a plan, a way to move forward. And he had no idea how to get them out of this. The only thing he knew was that the girl's safety came first. Everything else could wait. He looked over at her, his voice softer now. "We're going to get through this," he said, though even he wasn't sure if he believed the words. She met his eyes, her gaze steady. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake let himself believe it, too. Jake sat in the small, dimly lit cabin, his back against the wall, eyes closed as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the room. The girl was asleep on the couch, her head resting against a torn pillow, her breathing steady. The exhaustion had caught up with them, but Jake couldn't let himself rest. His mind was still on high alert. The truck, Mason's men, the case. Everything was converging into a storm that he didn't know how to survive. He had promised the girl he would protect her, but the reality was, the odds were stacked against them. They couldn't run forever. They couldn't hide forever. The world had already found them once, and it wouldn't stop until they were both silenced. Jake leaned forward, rubbing his eyes as he replayed everything that had happened. He had no choice but to face it. Mason's men weren't going to stop, not without getting what they wanted. And what was inside the case was something bigger than any of them could understand. Jake had spent years running from his past, from the things he had done, but now his past had caught up with him, and it wasn't just his life on the line anymore. The girl was in this, too. She didn't deserve any of this. Jake looked over at her, her small frame curled up on the couch, looking so innocent, so fragile. She was too young to be tangled in all of this, but Jake knew that there was no way out now. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let her down. He stood up slowly, careful not to wake her, and walked to the window. The night outside was quiet, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it soon. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. They were going to have to face Mason's men head-on. Jake's jaw tightened as he made up his mind. He didn't know how they were going to get out of this, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let them take the girl. He wasn't going to let them take the case. He turned back toward the girl, watching her for a moment, and then moved to the table, gathering the case and the documents. The weight of it felt heavier than ever. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about getting away. This was about putting an end to it, about making sure that the secrets inside that case never saw the light of day. He wasn't going to let anyone else suffer because of them. The girl stirred on the couch, her eyes fluttering open as she sat up. Jake put the case down, meeting her gaze. "We're leaving," he said, his voice firm, but gentle. The girl blinked, clearly disoriented, but she didn't question him. She was used to this. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. Jake hesitated, then nodded toward the door. "We're going to find a way to end this. Once and for all." The girl didn't say anything more, just nodded and stood up, following him to the door. They moved out into the night, the air cold against their skin. Jake's instincts were on high alert, his senses tuned to every rustle in the trees, every sound in the distance. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, but Jake didn't know what to say. There was so much they still didn't know, so much that was still out of their control. But for now, they had one goal: to get out of the woods, away from Mason's men, and put an end to the nightmare. They walked quickly, the woods dense around them. Jake's thoughts kept returning to the girl, to the promise he'd made. He had to keep her safe. He had to protect her. They reached the edge of the woods, and Jake stopped, scanning the area. He could hear the distant sound of a car, the faint rumble of an engine. Mason's men were close. They weren't far behind. He turned to the girl. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice urgent. "I need to check something." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear but trust in them. Jake moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as he approached the road. His heart was pounding as he peered through the trees, watching the headlights of the approaching vehicle. It was them. He could see their silhouette against the dim light, their movements too deliberate, too precise. Jake knew that if they were caught now, there would be no escape. He had to make this work. He waited until the vehicle passed, the sound of its engine fading into the distance, before he signaled for the girl to move. They couldn't waste any more time. Jake led the way, keeping low and quiet, moving fast but careful. They had no time to spare. The final confrontation was coming, and Jake knew it was inevitable. They had to be ready. The girl walked beside him, her pace steady, her face set with determination. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a spark of hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could beat the odds. They reached the next town by dawn, the sleepy streets still dark and quiet. They needed a place to hide, a place to regroup, but Jake knew they couldn't stay here for long. Mason's men were relentless. They would find them. But for now, they had a moment of peace. They had made it this far. And maybe, just maybe, they could make it the rest of the way. In this gripping Hell Angels stories, Jake and the young girl find themselves trapped in a dangerous situation as they run from a past that refuses to stay buried. As they journey through dark woods, seeking shelter from relentless enemies, their bond grows stronger, and they must rely on each other to survive. Along the way, they uncover secrets that threaten not only their lives but the safety of everyone around them. With danger lurking at every turn, they must outsmart those chasing them, all while Jake struggles to protect the girl and keep the powerful case hidden. The Hell Angels stories are filled with suspense, as every decision could be their last. From secretive enemies to hidden truths, they are caught in a whirlwind of betrayal and danger. As the night deepens and the threats close in, they must find a way to fight back, but time is running out. Will they manage to escape the wrath of those seeking the case, or will they be caught in the storm? This intense journey through a world of chaos and betrayal will keep you on the edge of your seat, wondering what's next in the ever-evolving Hell Angels stories. With each passing hour, the stakes rise higher, and the mystery deepens. The girl's fate is intertwined with a past she doesn't understand, but she has no choice but to keep moving forward, trusting Jake to keep her safe in a world that doesn't play by the rules. The Hell Angels stories take you through every twist and turn as these two fight to stay alive and keep the dangerous secrets buried for good.